A special guest I want to introduce that's been on the program before, Dr. Jameson Taylor. He's Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs with the American Family Association. He's with us now. Hey, Jameson, welcome back to the program.
Hey, Walker, great to be on today.
Well, Jameson, I wanted to have you on to talk about something that as ideological conservatives and Christians engaged in American civics, something that we're going to have to put our radar on, we're going to have to focus on and figure out a solution with. So what we're seeing now and what we've seen historically is this constitutional amendment, or some people call it the ballot initiative process around the nation in various states, has been used for decades, for a long, long time, to do various things, various policy changes at the state level. And historically, conservatives have, I wouldn't say dominated this space, but have utilized this space a little bit more than the left, to push forth our wish list items, i.e., the marriage amendment and various pro-life amendments to various state constitutions. But Jameson, what we're seeing now is a capitalization from the left on this ballot initiative process. They're pouring millions into it around the country. But give us kind of a backgrounder to where we've been with this ballot amendment process and where you think we're going, which isn't very good.
So about 26 states have a ballot initiative process. And what that means is that voters sign petitions, and then they can submit these petitions to their Secretary of State or whoever it may be to amend their constitution, or in some cases to get laws passed on different issues. You're right. Back in the early 2000s and prior to that, the conservative movement used the ballot initiative process in particular to defend one man, one woman marriage. We saw the courts strike that down almost every single time, which is very frustrating. More recently, though, the left has figured out how to use the ballot initiative process. First thing they did is the marijuana industry figured out that in red states in particular, where lawmakers were blocking the legalization of marijuana, the marijuana industry went in and used the ballot initiative process to legalize so-called medical marijuana. Now, there's really no difference between medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. What we're seeing now more and more is that as the marijuana industry loses money, because they're being undersold, in fact, by illegal drugs, they're pushing now to legalize more and more hardcore drugs. But the marijuana industry is kind of the first group that really opened up this idea of using the ballot initiative process. Now, once we conservatives won at the Supreme Court and overturned Roe v. Wade, the left really started to look at the ballot initiative process as a way to push a pro-abortion agenda in red states. The first state we saw was Kansas, which is a pretty pro-life state, where the left flooded Kansas with money. They confused voters, and voters voted against really basic pro-life protections. We saw then after that in Kentucky and Michigan and other states that are fairly conservative, pro-life initiatives lost big at the ballot box. Now, why did that happen? It was not because these voters suddenly became pro-abortion. In fact, what is happening is the left is going into red states to go around voters. They're going into red states to go around legislatures. We're talking about states in which, conservatives have worked really hard, for instance, to elect a governor, to elect a Republican House, a Republican Senate. They have the so-called trifecta. They're in a place where they should be able to get a lot done. And what the left is doing is they're going around these legislatures. They're disenfranchising red state voters. They're going around these legislatures and using the ballot initiative process to get what they want. And they have been very clear that this is their strategy. For instance, about 6 months ago, the New York Times came out and said, this is the way to go in red states. We're going to use the ballot initiative process. Now, why has the left been so successful? Because they are outspending us. For instance, we saw recently in Ohio, there was a very important vote related to how to treat the ballot initiative process. The Ohio legislature very wisely wanted to put in some safeguards to make sure that out-of-state dark money was not coming into their state to overwhelm communities, to overwhelm voters. We saw dark money groups, beginning with Arabella Advisors, which is, if you have not heard of them, Google them, learn about them. Arabella Advisors. They are a very powerful and very wealthy group of leftist investors that are putting money into all kinds of initiatives around the country. They dumped in at least $3.5 million into Ohio to oppose the Ohio legislature, to oppose something called Issue 1. After them came another group called the Tides Foundation. They put in another at least $2 million to also confuse voters in Ohio. They just overwhelmed the voters. So we're going to see this in state after state. It's been happening all over the place. And really what we're seeing, Ohio is kind of a lesson for this. The left is just absolutely committed to winning every ballot initiative. They're going to lie. They're going to confuse voters. They're going to overwhelm conservatives with outside money. The second thing, though, that happened in Ohio, which is a lesson to learn, is the left used absentee and mail-in ballots to get what they wanted. We saw 700,000 absentee ballots in Ohio. In fact, the conservatives won the day of election votes. They won the vote on the day of the election because people had figured out that this was a scam. They had figured out that they should vote yes on this reforms that their legislature wanted. But we saw so many absentee ballots had already come in that even though the conservatives won the day of election voting, they lost because of this massive influx of absentee ballots. So there's going to be two things to watch kind of going into the presidential elections and just kind of and going into, looking at where we are as a country right now. The left is using that ballot initiative process to go around state legislatures. They're also focusing on absentee and mail-in ballots, just as they did in the previous presidential elections. That's going to be something to watch very carefully. The third thing that they're doing, though, is the Biden administration is using federal rulemaking to go around red states. There's an avalanche of rules which is coming out of the federal government right now related to everything. We talked about natural gas ovens. The federal government wants to outlaw gas ovens. More seriously, what they're doing is they have a rule. Basically, they want to shut down all independent drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. That's going to reduce the production in the Gulf of Mexico by like 35%. So if you think oil prices are high now, when you go to the pump and fill up your car, if you're hurting right now, and I know that I am, the price of gas and the price of food, just inflation. If you think you're hurting now, wait until this rule goes through and see how expensive gas is. Think about the jobs that are going to be lost in Gulf states, Louisiana and Alabama. There's going to be massive job losses because the Biden administration is literally shutting down these independent drillers. So these three things, the ballot initiative process, the voting process, and federal rulemaking, it's crushing conservatives. Even at the state level, they're blocking conservative legislatures from being able to do anything significant.
Let me ask you this, Jameson, because I don't, at a glance, if you will, I don't like absentee voting. All right, I don't like mail-in voting, and here's why. People don't mind. They can make it to the movie theater on the weekend. They can make it to their favorite sports game. They can most of the time make it to work on time, and they can make it to the beach for vacation right on time. But you start talking about voting, and it's like, oh, goodness, I've got to vote, and I don't know if I can make it to the poll, and I'm going to mail in my ballot 3 weeks before. I'm not a big fan of it because, look, either you can vote on Election Day or you can't, and if you can't, I'm sorry. I get there's medical needs. Some people are homebound, and that's an exception. But for the most part, Jameson, this idea of able-bodied adults mailing in their ballot weeks before the election just because it's an inconvenience to go vote on Election Day, I'm not a big fan of it. But let me ask you this. Am I being too old school? Are we as conservatives going to have to adopt this new way of voting by mail?
So I think that absentee ballots, and the left used COVID to push absentee ballots and mail-in ballots. What Republicans have been doing around the country is implementing voter ID. When you go vote, you have to show your ID, and that makes sense. And so they prevented some of the fraud that was going on in our elections by requiring voter ID. Well, then COVID hits, And you have this, basically, it seems like this necessity that you have to suddenly mail in your ballots. Well, the left uses that, and they do something that's called ballot harvesting. The way ballot harvesting works is a nonprofit organization, for instance, may go into a nursing home and they have pre-filled out absentee ballots, and they give people the ballots and say, hey, do you want to vote for so-and-so? And they're like, sure. You know, some of these people don't even know who they're voting for. And then they take these ballots, they drop them into what are called ballot drop boxes. So you don't even have to see a person. You know, there's no verification. There's no government official anywhere involved to verify, are these ballots legitimate? And those are being counted. What you're also seeing is after the election, I mean, frankly, in some areas, there's this sense of, well, how many votes do we need to actually win this election? I mean, it kind of felt like this in Pennsylvania in the recent Senate elections, where there were so many absentee ballots. It felt like this when you had all the Zuckerbucks that poured into Pennsylvania during the presidential election. It was like, well, give us a few days and we'll figure out how many ballots we need to count to make sure that Joe Biden wins. And, you know, that's the problem with mail-in and absentee ballots, that there's not enough verification. In Mississippi, for instance, they tried to pass a very, very mild protection to say, you know, only legitimate family members can send in mail-in ballots and absentee ballots. And the court struck that down. So, I mean, it's going to be very hard to regulate this. States are going to be better off by limiting their absentee and mail-in ballot process, because it is just a wide open door for fraud. You know, but as you point out, some Republicans even support this. We saw the liberal Delbert Hosemann here in Mississippi. He supported early voting and these absentee ballots and things like that. You know, it's a real problem, I think, because the left is using this to cheat in elections. And, you know, given everything, frankly, the way that the Biden administration has targeted President Trump and everything going on, I think we have to be honest. I don't expect that we're going to have a fair election going into this next presidential race. I mean, we need to be very concerned, not just who the next president is going to be, but about the integrity of our democracy. Yeah. I mean, we're in trouble right now.
Yeah, and you know, you everything you're saying is backed up by the data. It's backed up by reality. And what's makes me cynical is that many of the people in our country care more about Ukraine's democracy than our very own. And by the way, Ukraine is skipping elections and they're jailing political opponents with no due process. So that's not much of a democracy. But here we are, and we've got some serious questions about our election processes. But on this ballot initiative or ballot amendment process that's the key focus of what we're talking about today, what is the way forward? I mean, do we need to continue pushing Ohio type measures to amend and raise the threshold for amending our Constitution?
Well, first, if you live in a state, and you know, about half the states do not have a ballot initiative process. So this is not necessary to have. I mean, you know, some people say this is a basic right of a democracy. Really, this whole ballot initiative process was popularized by the progressive movement in the late 1800s and the 1920s. It was literally, these are folks that are early Marxists, and they saw this is a tool that we can use to confuse people and to get what we want. So from the very beginning, the ballot initiative process has been problematic. It has not really been a friend of conservatives. So first, if you live in one of those states where you do not have a ballot initiative process, you don't want it. Make sure that you don't get it. Make sure that it stays dead. Here in Mississippi, our state Supreme Court struck down our ballot initiative process. We do not want to bring that back. It is not going to do any good for conservative voters in Mississippi to have a ballot initiative process. If we get that back, what's going to happen is abortion legalization. You're going to see gun control. In Florida right now, for instance, the left is dumping a ton of money to basically outlaw rifles and shotguns. I mean, this is a real thing. So you're going to see gun control, and you're going to see welfare Medicaid expansion. These are the priorities of the left, and they're using the ballot initiative to get these things. So first, make sure you don't get a ballot initiative process if you don't have one. If you do have one, then you need to look at some safeguards. Now, for instance, what Ohio tried to do, they said instead of just a 50% majority to amend our Constitution, we want to have a little bit more. We're going to require 60% to make sure that people really support what is being proposed. What Ohio also proposed, which is very good, is to say that every county in our state has to be part of this process, that every county has to provide 5% of the signatures that would go into this ballot initiative process. The reason they did that is to make sure that urban areas don't overwhelm the rural areas in this process, because what you're seeing is the left is dumping a ton of money into urban areas to hijack these things.
Yeah.
Those are two safeguards that you can pursue.
Absolutely. Hey, Jameson, thanks so much for coming on and giving us the background here.
Thanks, Walker.
All right. Appreciate it. So, folks, this is something that we need to keep our radar on about, and that is the ballot initiative, ballot amendment process in states around the country. It is a tool that the left is using heavily in recent months and years, and we've got to be in front of that and fend off these moves by those Marxists. We'll be back in a few.